access to land in the Middle East and North Africa. So before we start, please be aware that we have simultaneous translations to Arabic. So check at the top of the chat field, you will see interpretation, the French button to interpretation, but this is for Arabic. So make sure you are in the right channel, the French channel for Arabic, and in the English channel for everybody else. Let me introduce myself. My name is Laura Meggiolaro. I'm team leader at the Land Portal Foundation, which is a Dutch no-profit organization that work globally towards improving access to land-related data and information to all. So we provide a global, free, and open data platform to help make invisible data visible and available to everyone. So for this, we collaborate with a large network of international, regional, and local organizations around the world. So before introducing our esteemed panelists, a few logistical notes. So this webinar is being recorded, so will be available for later consultation, both through the Land Portal and on our YouTube channel. So following the presentations from our panelists, we will have 30 minutes to address your questions. Feel free to put your question in the Q&A feature, or you can also use the chat if you want others to read your question. And finally, we are also live tweeting the webinar using English and Arabic, so please follow us on Twitter as well. A bit of context about this webinar is the second webinar of a series, aside of the second Arab Land Conference, which is a conference that took place from 22 to 24 of February this year in Cairo, Egypt, and also online. So the conference was organized by the Housing and Building National Research Center, represented by the Urban Training and Studies Institute, in partnership with UN Habitat, the Global Land Tool Network, the World Bank, and GIZ, and the Dubai Land Department in the context of the Arab Land Initiative. So it was a platform to discuss countries' experiences and new research to support good land governance in the Arab region. Gender land rights, of course, was one of the main topics discussed throughout the conference. And in a minute, I will give the floor to our colleague, Umberta Tempra, who will tell more about that. Now, 2 minutes to discuss the topic of this webinar, why women land rights and access to information and technologies. Well, in more than 30 countries, women and girls do not have the same rights to own and inherit land as men and boys. And in dozens of others, custom undermine women's rights to land and property. This tenure and security constrains social and economic opportunities for more than 1 billion urban and rural women. So this phenomenon is also not well documented. As we know, the World Bank estimates that 90% of the rural land in sub-Saharan Africa is undocumented. So women land and property rights are the least likely to be documented. So there is a tremendous gap in understanding how many women own or do not own land, or we don't know much about their legal recognitions, but also we do not know much about if they feel at risk of losing their hands or other challenges. It's impossible to understand if we do not measure a phenomena. It's very difficult to understand it. So the challenge faced by women in the Arab state is very similar to many other countries. It's not very different from other parts of Africa and the world. There are many barriers here as well, and our panelists will speak about it. These barriers include conflict, in-house or community conflicts, or lack of access to institutions of power, or social norms at community or family level. In the Middle East and North Africa, as for today, only the 5% of women have their name on a legal land or housing document. So despite the lack of data, there are a growing body of empirical research that demonstrates that by strengthening women's land and property rights can have a tremendous ripple effect on income, food security, land stewardship, and children welfare. But there are also many positive advancements, and our panelists will document and describe some of those. For instance, in the Arab countries, land administration practices that take women's perspective better into account lately, and also there are inheritance claiming that are being positive. So we have invited you here to this webinar to discuss what role information and access to information and data and digital technologies can play in improving, enhancing women access to land in this region. Why this specific angle? Well, because the land portal works in the intersection between land rights and access to data information, and how access to more information has a positive effect in land governance. So let's listen from our panelists. I will now introduce them. Our first panelist is Ms. Ombretta Tempra. Ombretta is an international development expert with 18 years of experience in program management and partnership development in developing and conflict-affected countries. She's currently a land specialist at the Regional Office for Arab States, UN Habitat. We also have Mr. Joe Feiertag. Joe is a research fellow in the Climate and Sustainability team at ODI. His research focuses on how land investment can be shaped in a socially and environmentally responsible way, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Joe is also involved in an initiative called Prindex, which is a data initiative, a global data initiative funded by FCDO and Omidyar Network. Then we have Ms. Foteini Zampati. Foteini is a legal professional with 18 years of experience. She's been working as data rights research specialist in support of the Global Open Data for Agriculture and Nutrition initiative. We also have Wael Zakut. Wael is the World Bank Senior Technical Advisor and Global Lead for Land and Geospatial. Mr. Zakut has a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in Land Policy and Geospatial. We also have Miriam Ababsa, French-Algerian social geographer, expert on land issues, housing and urban planning in Jordan and Syria. She's also an associate researcher at the French Institute for the Near East and a former World Bank consultant. Very rich panel, and we will also hear from the audience. Dr. Dina Naguib, PhD candidate on urban design and community development at Cairo University, and Winnie Kamau, a journalist hailing from Nairobi, Kenya. Okay, let's start. I will ask questions to the panelists who will respond over the next 45 minutes, and then we will start, we will open the Q&A for addressing your questions. Let me now give the floor for the next 10 minutes to Ombretta. Ombretta, what have been some of the most important takeaways regarding women's land rights during the recent second Arab Land Conference? And what are the challenges that women face in accessing land in conflict-affected context? How this can be mitigated? Over to you, Ombretta. We cannot hear you, Umberta. You are muted.
Thank you so much. Yes, thanks a lot, Laura, for introducing me. Welcome, everybody. I'm very happy to be part of this webinar and discussing this very important issue. I would like to briefly report back on what was discussed on the theme at the recently concluded Arab Land Conference, where the issue of women access to land and women land rights was actually quite at the center of very many discussions, particularly a high-level session that was all on the topic, then a roundtable on the land rights of displaced women, and a technical session where papers were presented. Some of the outcomes, obviously, this slide doesn't make justice to all the content that was developed, but in a nutshell, also compared to what was discussed in the previous conference, in this one, which was held 3 years ago, in this one, really women land rights were much more openly discussed and acknowledged by both partners and also government representatives. So the importance and urgency of securing women land rights really came out very clearly. And also many correlations were unpacked by the different speakers between women land rights and other aspects of social economic development, also peace and stability, human rights, food security, and better ability of women, but family as a whole, to cope with conflicts and climate-related challenges. Land rights were clearly identified as a tool for empowerment of women, especially if coupled with additional initiatives and intervention like increased access to credit, public participation, and decision-making over the rights that women have to make decisions over the land and properties. Various experiences were presented with a lot of focus, particularly on women access to housing. So access to housing for women, vulnerable women, widows, women head of household in different cases. Jordan was one of them. A lot of discussion also took place around the impact of the plurality of legal system and discriminatory practices on women access to land, enjoyment of their land rights, and also their deprivation, particularly the deprivation of their inheritance share in some contexts. That really is one of the point that was raised by many speakers. Some of these practices and also laws in some cases has been repealed. But still, so there is a lot of action also on the legal aspect to actually improve the situation for women, although still we know the region has a very wide gender gap on this issue. Even if we don't really have consolidated data to the extent that we are really able to put numbers to it, but anecdotal evidence or evidence that we are starting to build up shows that still the gap is wide to fill. Also, a lot of attention on women living in displacement, where we see that women knowledge of their rights is inadequate. And also there is a lot lack of civil documentation and difficulties in accessing justice that really hamper their access to land. However, change is possible and is happening, and a lot of positive cases were presented. I also want to briefly touch upon a campaign that was launched by Inhabitat and its partners, Women and Land in the Arab region, and you can find more information on it, and also information that you can share at the website that is indicated there. And this campaign revolves around some key messages that touch on 5 topics. Why women need access to land, because a lot of times I think this aspect is left behind because people don't really see the correlation and the urgency of this. How to increase it in developmental but also in humanitarian context. And then how to promote women participation in decision making. We touch also briefly on Islamic land law. So I think on why women need land rights, I think Laura already touched upon it. And I believe most of you already know about that, but it's about financial security, increase of self-determination, a change of power relations within the household are rebalanced when land property arrangements are changed, agricultural productivity, overall increase in decision making. There is also a section on the, why women need access to land in displacement and crisis affected contexts. And then the how. I think this is also something where data will help us more to understand better where exactly are the gap and where we should focus. But overall, there is need of increasing awareness on the topic. Also increase and protect better women land rights at the time of marriage, because that's where the land and property arrangements within the family get redefined. Protect women inheritance right. We know, although we don't know for sure the exact share, that the majority of women, the wide majority of women actually access land ownership through inheritance, particularly in rural areas. And for this reason, inheritance is very important, and we would like to know more about that. And also, we need to strengthen secondary land uses for women, secondary land rights. So not only ownership, which only very few women have, as we were hearing before from Laura, but also the other types of land access that women have, ability to stay or use, or, other people property, or maybe rent properties, etc. So this is very important as well. Practical support is needed because, of course, legislations and norms go only that far in providing actual access to the women on the ground. And also increase women access to justice and dispute resolution is important. We see that many women more than men struggle in accessing justice, courts, and other dispute resolution systems. Overall, of course, an improvement in land administration, which is also badly needed in the region, would definitely improve women land rights as well as men land rights, because obviously the two parts go hand in hand. Now we are discussing women land rights, but whatever measure that actually promotes women land right will ultimately also benefit vulnerable men. And of course, when needed, reform constitution and policies that are remaining gender discriminatory. Some messages revolve about how to address the multiple legal system where a lot of cracks are left, where women land rights fall. And lastly, as I was saying, the messages also touch briefly on Islamic land law. This is because, of course, is one of the sources of law used in the region, on which also a lot of national legislation are based. And we see that in many cases, misinterpreted Islamic land principle actually negatively affect women because of this misinterpretation. So although, of course, we still promote international laws and national laws are the main source of laws to promote women land rights, it's still important to clarify actually what the plurality of legal system, and particularly Islamic land law, says. To conclude, I invite all of you to look at more in detail on these messages and what we propose in practice to increase women land rights in the Arab region. And I look forward to hear from the other panelists on their contribution. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bretta. This was really insightful. It was indeed a rich conference, and women land rights really resonates with. Was one of the main topic discussed during the conference. I want to now invite other panelists to discuss about this topic in particular. Well, I will now want you to tell us about your experience working in this region. What do you think the main challenges, the main obstacles are in addressing women and rights in the Arab context and what can be done? Do you have any anecdotal story to tell us? What is your view about this issue in this particular context? We know that every context is different.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to see so many colleagues connected to this. As probably all know, that the access to land and property is one of the very important pillar of the women empowerment. This has been highlighted by the gender study of the World Bank, but also many other gender research. So it really is a very important element. The Arab region, I would say, on land issues in general, there are many challenges. Amrita, mentioned a little bit of it. It's clearly, the land governance in the region, it does not really rank, I would say, well compared to other regions. Many countries actually rank, very low in the World Bank doing business of registering, property. But I will not talk about the broader land. I will talk about the, on the land issues that are affecting women. There are two major issues, I would say. One is with regard to the inheritance. How usually, men and women get their land, in general. They get it through two main ways. One is they get it through inheritance from their parents, or they buy it, during their life. And we have two serious challenges facing women, in these two areas. On inheritance, sadly, I will say, many Arab women, they don't get their rightful inheritance rights, when it comes to land and property. In fact, we did a study in Palestine, a research study in Palestine, show that I think it's less than 30% of women they get their inheritance right. The other part is when people buy property, the tradition that men, they register the property in their name, and they don't put the name of the woman on the title. As a result of this, if there's a death in the family, or if there's a divorce, very often women, they get they don't get anything, literally, and they miss out. And in many cases, women contribute to the property as much as men. In fact, probably in some cases even more. So they lose as big. So the issues in the region, we know it well. They don't get enough inheritance. They don't get the inheritance right, land, and their names are not, on the title. The problem, and I see it, and probably we know the solution, I would say, the solution is increased public awareness, and probably there's there's some kind of adjustment on the laws, and so on. Always the problem, and I'm really challenged with, is how to get there, to really to work on a plan, to implement the solution, to increase awareness, of the, society. I would say, awareness of women is very important, but I think is equally important, even more important, awareness of men, and as well, really to honor, because women are really the mother, the sisters, the daughter, all of us, and when we empower them, will empower the entire society. And we need to increase clearly the awareness of the importance of women land rights to the broader economic, a growth agenda, of the countries. It's still, as we know, the women participation in the labor force in MENA region in North Africa is one of the lowest in the world. And if the region is going to move economically, forward, we have to give the women, the opportunity to move forward. There is one issue I will raise it here. Maybe we'll come back to it in the discussion. I know there's a lot of discussion about equal rights for women. Personally, I'm very much, with it, and I think it's like all of us. We really would like, to move to equal rights, inheritance right for women. the issue is really complicated, in the MENA region. The religion play a very important role, in the society. And if you're going to promote equal rights, probably you're going to, to face the challenge from at least the religious establishment, and might actually becomes, counterproductive. But it's an area where I think it probably will really be good to come back to it as part of the discussion, which is more effective, is to promote, really pushing very hard and increase the awareness to get women access to their rightful inheritance right according to the Sharia law, or somehow promote, more equitable, or equal rights for inheritance. So these are really debate is good, actually, just maybe to hear also discussion on this point. So let me stop.
Very much. Well, thank you, and thank you for stressing the importance of awareness raising. And we know how much information is important in this game of increasing awareness through increasing access to information. I will go back to this point later. Now I want to hear from Miriam about the specific situation in Jordan. Miriam, can you tell us more about women access to land in Jordan? What are the
Yes, thank you very much. So Jordan is like the other countries. We have some data showing that they own less than 7% of the land. In fact, we are talking about statistics. In fact, you should compare men access to land to female access to land. Okay. Well, basically in Jordan, half the men own a plot of land. So 51%, according to the Department of Statistics 2012. And 60% own an apartment. To be compared to only 6.8% for women of land and of apartment. In fact, you have all a discussion concerning the fact that you have rights that are enshrined in the Constitution, and you have also, as Dr. Wael mentioned it, a very strong importance of the religious norms and the fact that, and it's really interesting, the fact that pastoral land could be inherited equally between men and women, but property of rural land and of course urban land apply the Sharia, by which you receive as a daughter half the share of your brother, but as a widow you could receive 1/8. It's always mentioned 1/8, which could be high. Okay, so this is in theory. But in practice, what do we see? We see three phenomena. Social pressure to women to renounce to their inheritance. And I would like to mention that specifically because women rights activists have been working not against, but with the Supreme Court of the Sharia, Qadi al-Quda, in 2010. And they managed, so it's the Jordan National Forum for Women and Mizan, they managed to introduce an amendment to the inheritance law, which is the following: several amendments. First, a period of a 3-month period during which women cannot renounce to their inheritance. This is really interesting, and it has an impact already. In 2014, statistics show that 1/3 of inheritance cases were followed by exclusion, taharuj, where women renounced to their inheritance. And in 2020, it went down to only 20%. So you have a change that is occurring. Okay, we can discuss that. Another point interesting by the law is that from 2010 law, an amendment, Article 319, mentioned that now you should be informed about all the property owned by your father or grandfather. So you should be informed. You should not be kept ignorant of what is at stake, the property. This is very interesting. And also very important to mention that in Jordan, you have the same rule applying to also the Christian women. So there might be a minority, but Christians are large landowners, and very important element for the political economy of the country, having a lot of insurance company and pharmaceutical companies and a major role, in Jordan. So it's very interesting to see that the patriarchal norms are not linked to an Islamic culture, but in fact to a patriarchal Arab culture, that overarch also this. But as I mentioned, there are some hopes, and we can, so in detail, you have several techniques to deprive women from inheritance. One is, of course, life donation. When you give land while you are still alive, to your sons or to your brother if you have only women, daughters. But we will see that, and I will mention that later on, another key problem is the absence of land subdivision. So the plot of land is still of the grandfather, is still not subdivided. And this is a point I will come back on later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. Very informative. Thank you for describing the situation in Jordan. You mentioned a bit of statistical data. So, and we know that this global phenomena needs to be better documented. So I now want to bring Jo into the forum and ask about your, we know that 5% of women owns land and property in the MENA region. We heard about 7% in Jordan, but still is one of the lowest rates in the world. You've been part of an initiative that made a global survey of over 140 countries, conducted by Panelists, and you were part of. Just wanted to ask, can you tell more about the findings in this region? Jo, over to you.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Laura, and thank you already to the other panelists, because I think you've already said a lot of the stuff that I wanted to talk about. But it's really good to back up some of the things that you've said already in data. And I'll give you, we've got many findings that we presented in 2 papers at the Arab Land Conference a couple of weeks ago, but two of them really I feel very strongly about. So first of all, the first finding is really about experiences of women, women's ownership, and that's very different from that of men. So Prindex asked about 14,000 men and women in 13 countries in the Arab region about how they perceived their tenure status to be. So whether they considered themselves individual joint owners, whether they were renters or had more informal tenure arrangements, such as staying in family-owned property. And this, I wasn't planning to present any slides, but I think it's easier if I talk about this with the help of some visuals, than try and repeat these statistics to you orally. But the columns on the very right, those two really show you the results for the MENA region as a whole across the 13 countries. And what you can see there is that about 40% of men said that they considered themselves individual or joint owners of the main property they lived in. And that was about double the rate among women, which was about 20%. So 1 in 5 women that consider themselves individual joint owners. And you can see as well, if you look at it across the sub-regions, that in the Mashrek region, those differences are biggest or widest. So in countries like Yemen or Egypt, where the rates of individual joint ownership among men are really, 2 or 3 times higher than they are among women. And in the Maghreb region, you can see Morocco stands out there as well. So that was really a sort of eye-opener to us. Of course, when you look at what explains those differences, as the other panelists might have already suggested, and you can see here highlighted in orange, is that most women, about 50% of women across the region, consider themselves as living in family-owned property. so that they don't consider themselves individual joint owners. They consider the property they live in as belonging to the family. And that can have many reasons. I'll talk a bit more about this later, but the way the methodology works is that we randomize within the household. So we might speak to very young women, above the age of 18, but, who are still staying with their parents. We might also speak to older grandparents, both male and female. And obviously in those sort of situations, you might imagine those respondents saying that they stay in family-owned property rather than, individually or jointly owning the property. But the difference still exists between male and female spouses, and that's really important to us. I should say that's not necessarily a bad thing to live in family-owned property, and I'll come back to that a bit later. But what the data really shows us is that men have that individual joint right to the property, and that comes with many benefits that we associate with empowerment, we associate with economic opportunity, and that are withheld from women. Benefits like deciding what's going to be planted on land that's attached to the property, or deciding whether the property is going to be rented out, or whether it's going to be sold, or who's going to inherit the property. Those decisions aren't in the hands of women; they are in the hands of men, according to this data. The second finding that I wanted to really bring out is really the main purpose of Prindex, which is to assess levels of tenure security. What we define as tenure security is perceptions of tenure security. So we go beyond that legal definition of tenure security, whether people have legal rights to land and property, and ask people how likely or unlikely it is that they will be expropriated from their land in the next 5 years. And based on what I just said, you might expect that levels of tenure security are very different between men and women. That security would be higher for men than it is among women, because men are more likely to have individual joint ownership rights in the region. But actually that isn't really the case, and there are good reasons for that. The levels are quite similar between men and women, and you can see that from this graph over here, which shows you the rates of tenure insecurity. So the share of men and women who considered it likely or very likely that they would be asked to leave within the next 5 years. And really there isn't much difference between men and women. I mean, there is a difference, but it's not as big as the difference in levels of individual or joint ownership. And like I said, one of the reasons for that is simply that staying in family-owned property doesn't necessarily have to be associated with insecurity. Quite the opposite. You can imagine that when your tenure is attached to your family arrangements, that it's actually a very strong and secure form of tenure that's very unlikely to be disrupted, and makes people that reside in it feel very secure. But the finding really is that if you look beyond the 5-year horizon, and this is a sort of slight criticism, not really a criticism, but something that we need to ask ourselves when we look at the SDG indicator for 1.4.2, which is what the Prindex methodology is based on, is that the 5-year horizon may not be capturing the sources of insecurity that we should be looking at for women, because women's tenure is attached to the family arrangements. So it's therefore also very susceptible to changes in the structure of families, or changes in the social status of men and women. And the most obvious example of that is as the other panelists have already mentioned, is in the event of spousal death, of inheritance, of divorce as well. And so we actually complemented the main question with 2 further questions in the survey to ask men and women who are married how secure they would feel in the hypothetical event of a spousal death or divorce. And that's when the differences really start to emerge. So overall, about 40% of married women said that they felt insecure in a divorce scenario. and compared to only 7% of men in the region. And so that was quite striking. If you remove that 5-year horizon, you suddenly open up this huge gender gap in the tenure security between men and women. And by the way, this also applies for spousal death scenarios as well. So that was the real eye opener for us in the Panelists findings for the region, and something that we really need to address going forward.
Thank you, Joe. This was very informative, and thank you for reminding us on the importance of the continuum of land rights. And it's not just a title that makes people feel secure on their land. Sometimes the use rights are stronger than property rights. But let's hear from Dina. Now we are in this second part of the webinar, where we start discussing about how to measure, how to document this phenomenon, what has been done, what data exist. So Dina, there is this wide recognition, the land is one of the most important household assets for women and their food security and empowerment. So what are the potential for integrating digital information and technologies in existing land systems? And what are the challenges in the region? Can you show us any examples?
Yes, thank you, Laura. So this is a recent statistics from 2016 about the distribution of agriculture holders by sex. So it's working towards the target for the goal 5.8 about the sex segregated data. So it shows the difference between male holders and female holders. Of course, the ownership and control of land are two critical dimensions regarding women's land rights. As the landowner refers to the legally recognized land acquisition to use and to transfer land property, and while the control over land is associated with the ability to make decisions over this land. So I'll maybe jump to the digital innovations that are have put some potential. So mapping and location intelligence help organizations to unlock the power of data to create a stronger and more digital connected region. So we can use like platforms that are web-based data management platforms or mobile applications. Some applications work a participatory approach, on-ground approach, through empowering the citizens to the process and understanding their rights and documenting their lands and resources. So, for example, we have something called the MAST. It's a mobile application to secure tenure. It's an infographic, innovative participatory process that usually for women's programs, it's also it's already active in some of the countries, not in the region, but maybe in Africa. So it had good practice and success in some African countries like Burkina Faso, like Zambia, like Tunisia. And it mainly empowered by land surveys to map and validate their own land in a transparent and affordable documentation. So women learn about their land, their resources, their legal rights, and develop a strategy for verifying this information. So that's what I meant by mapping. It can help the stakeholders to visualize the spatial distribution and also the to address the complex problems in the region on ground, and if there are any disputes, and identify the boundaries while mapping. So they can share it with the local authorities, for example, and then after the verification, they can receive their land certificates through this process. So the digital technology presents new opportunities and innovations, and securing women access to land, maybe in customary tenure areas, which may need some change in legislations, and facilitate the technology transfer and increase the awareness of women and their participation, of course, in the decision-making forums. Also, another example, the GIS, it's embedded in many organizations on national level in Arab countries. So data accessibility is one part that we need to work on and review as an open data concern. But GIS had been a relation with the information technology infrastructure through the regional offices in some of the Gulf area and the northeastern Africa. through the resource planning, database management, and decision support. So we have some good success stories for that in Bahrain. For example, 12 municipalities are working on a land information system program to validate the data using the ARC SDE, which is the platform for ISRI and GIS. So another land management program also include land information on ownership details and property information. So they are layers of information that helps management of spatial and non-spatial data. Also, another programs in municipal governance and housing in Oman. There are another program for land management in Saudi Arabia, for Morocco, for agricultural land, and Tunisia as well. And also informal settlements in Egypt, they rely on that. So the programs just need to be more focused on gender data and segregation of this data. So moving to the other slide, the next slide, please, Stacy. So there are some challenges. So this is a digitized index that uncovers the strong variations across the Middle East countries between this demand and supply measures, between the ICT supply and innovation. We can see that according to what's displayed, we are in the low part. So there are some challenges if we are talking about implications of the community's capacity to sustain the initiatives, to the expenses of the technology. This is mainly one of the main challenges, and the softwares, the potential for mapping initiatives to unearth the existing land boundaries conflicts, and the choices that had to be made to secure this customary land rights of women. Moving to the other slide, also this relates to the digital usage gap across the Middle East and North Africa region. They come in order to transform the region into a digital region. There are some potential, but at least there is a gap now that had to be shown and addressed to work on. So one of also the other challenges is the gender perspective, according to the current endorsement of customary systems, land tenure and decentralization of the land management, because we had this digital, we have to say that we had a gender blind age between the 1910s and 1970. And the land reforms were based on the implicit assumption that assets allocated to households are typically for male head would benefit to the members, all members equitably, but this had to be changed. So we have to work maybe on the digital financials infrastructure and to provide the foundation for digital transformation in order to help to facilitate this transformation that we need, and the data to be collected into gender perspective data. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. Thank you for this very interesting perspective. Can I ask you, well, from your perspective as a geospatial expert, what do you think that documenting women land rights looks like in this region compared to other regions you work in?
Okay, I mentioned earlier the Arab region, they don't score well, on the the World Bank doing business indicator of registering property, and many countries still have a manual system, and they don't have all of the properties are registered, and this is really creating a major challenge, as we're dealing with the broader land governance issues, but also how it will apply, to women. There is a few countries, I would say, they're doing well. The GCC countries, scores very high. I think Qatar was scored #1, UAE was scored, I think it's scored #10. Saudi Arabia is scored, I think, at 24. And the rest of the GCC is actually scoring well. Many of them have electronic system, to registering property, so therefore they have, a clear access to information, about property registration. Jordan also, their system is very well electronic system, and but what we heard actually about the case of Jordan, the correlation between having a good electronic system of property registration and women access to land, they don't correlate. So probably you may have, very good, functioning land administration system, is an automated system, but it's still the fundamental challenges of women access to land. It's there. So therefore, in my view, and I think it's the fundamental issues. While I think is working on modernizing property registration and by completing the registration of all of the property, automate the functions, of land registration, provide information, free access to information about ownership to citizens and government agents in private sectors and bank. That does not substitute, in my view, of working, at all levels, to make sure that women, inheritance right are, provided, according to the existing law, which is, in many countries are the Sharia law, and the other one is making sure that the women, their name is on the property, title. Clearly, we need to deal with these things on, both on the public awareness, and I think this is where the digital technology, in my view, actually works extensively. While it's very important, we increase the public awareness through the traditional media. Still, lots of people in the region they watch the traditional media, the TV, radio, and and so on. But the younger generation is very much actually hooked onto the the social media. And many of them, in fact, actually they don't watch the traditional media. And therefore, any information campaign has to integrate the the social media as part of the activities. The other part, in my view, and I think there is still there is a legal intervention is needed. We saw the experience from Jordan, while which is actually has achieved some results, I would say, by making sure that the women they don't waive their rights on inheritance for 3 months. But I think it's much needed, on the legal side. I mean, for example, is registering women, opening a name of a woman on land title. There's might be a legal intervention, which is saying is, if all of the properties bought during marriage will be jointly held, between a man and a woman. Doesn't have to be physically the name of the woman on the title, but in the U.S. law, I'm not sure what the law in Europe, but any actually assets, as well as income or saving, where collected during the marriage will be, in a case of divorce, will be split, 50-50. And I think that clearly this is could be a legal intervention, but you really public awareness has to make sure that the society is accepting this legal intervention. Even in the, we know that many of the Arab regions are, the governance of these countries are, autocracy or, is not democratic. I would say, just put it mildly, but still they will be watching the public opinion, unless the public opinion supporting some of these legal intervention, in my view, it probably will not happen. So I think it's the two levels has to be on the public awareness campaign, but also need to accompany it by some legal reform in order to make sure that women have the rights.
Thank you, Well. But thank you for reminding us that having a strong digital record system doesn't necessarily translate into empowered women or more women land rights. But let's pause a little bit still on how we are doing in documenting rights to women access to land. And I wanted to bring in another panelist, Foteini, to talk about the open data mapping project. What are the implications for women and rights in the MENA region? Can you describe this project to us, Foteini?
Yes, sure. Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm going to talk a little bit about the open data mapping and how can really be linked with women's land rights, not only in the MENA region, but in general, I would say, mostly in developing countries. So open data mapping refers to the acquisition, processing, management, publication, and geovisualization of georeference data. And more specifically, open data mapping provides the special databases, maps, and geoinformation that are freely accessible and available globally. It provides the opportunity for everyone to freely share, use, and reuse data about land use, farmlands, land rights, and essentially anything that it is mapped on the Earth's surface. And open data mapping is about the fact, of course, that we can map land use. When it comes to agriculture, we do know that one of the basic questions is around location. Where are we currently farming and rearing livestock? So with open data mapping, we are able to know what is where and how as well, and who owns that land. It provides data for sharing about land documentation. So empowering women to drive open data mapping in agriculture is a sure trigger, I would say, of multiple and measurable targets of FDGs in the MENA region. Data about where and who is empowered is critical, as well as knowing, as I mentioned, who owns a parcel of land for agriculture and where it is located. And as a result of this, issues about women's land rights, agricultural sustainability, and the SDGs can be tackled with open data mapping. It can contribute to achieving SDGs targets and women's inclusive community engagement. It contributes to bridging the gap in gender digital divide by providing women the opportunity through capacity building and raising awareness to know about their land rights and benefits. So the approach of open data mapping would be that it has positive impacts about knowledge, about women's land rights, and agricultural sustainability, of course. So this is pretty much what it's about of open data mapping in general.
Thank you for the one last question to you, Jo, and on your data collection experience and how perceptual data can help us challenge sexist norms around land and housing more generally, and specifically in the MENA region. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, sure. So we actually quite recently published a blog about this on the CGIAR Engendering Data blog series, and that was together with Ruth Meitzen-Dick from IFPRI and Cheryl Doss from Oxford, who are both working with us on analysing the PrintNext data. And we recently published another paper on that in land use policy, actually, which I encourage you to read. And we are also preparing further papers on this. So I'll stop there with the self-promotion and talk about the ways in which we can use subjective data. So the first one I've already spoken about, which is how PrintNext or how perceptions data can be used to go beyond legal definitions of land rights and ownership. And that's already recognized in SDG 142, also in 5A1, which not only talks about men and women's legal rights to land and property, but also about their perceptions of those rights. And, you know, the other panelists, you know, while Miriam, they've all spoken about this, which is that even where there are legal protections in place, where governments have introduced gender equal rights to land and property, it's not necessarily the case that those rights are exercised or practiced in the way that they should be. And, you know, the example that we always use is from the World Bank and the women, specifically the Women Business and Law database, which says that 171 countries out of 190 in the world have laws in place to guarantee equal home ownership rights between land and women. But we can see from the data that women aren't always able to exercise those rights. And that's especially the case in the Arab region. The second way in which we can use subjective data to tackle sexist norms around land and property, and just give me a second while I bring up the screen again, is to pair it with objective data, as we call perceptions data, subjective, but we can also collect objective data characteristics and that can help governments to see where their legal protection is not being effective. And the example, again, from the Arab region that other panelists have spoken about is that of young women in particular being forced to, or being asked to, renounce their legal rights, even if it's under Sharia law or Islamic law or other laws, where they are asked to renounce their legal rights to land and property to their brothers and to their uncles. And for instance, this is showing the data, rates of tenure security between men and women by objective data characteristic. And you can see where the differences lie. The women's rates are in orange, the men's rates are in purple. And you can see that there's a big difference between men and women within the 18 to 24 age category. So that really shows you that, especially if you go on to analyze the data further, it's especially the case in rural regions where young women obviously feel quite insecure about their land and property rights. And the possible reason for that may be that they are being asked to renounce their rights. And so that gives governments an idea of where to strengthen the legal rights that they've already put in place, whether that's through awareness raising, as the other panelists have spoken about. Another good example of that is by using male champions, so male members of the community to promote women's land rights and champion them, and to force that change in social norms and attitudes that's so important to achieve this. Just very briefly, I mean, there's another area in the Arab region, which is especially among women who are financially disadvantaged. And there are big gender differences when you look at the differences between tenure security of men and women in low income groups. And then finally, third, let me just stop sharing this so they concentrate. The third way in which we can use subjective data to tackle sexist norms is actually by asking men and women about their preferences. And I know this sounds a bit strange, but actually I was very happy that Wael talked about the Gulf countries, because this is where you can see this as an opportunity. Because there's some very interesting research by Najjar, but also others, that shows that in many Arab countries, women actually don't prefer to inherit fixed assets such as land and property, especially when it's in rural areas that are affected by these patriarchal social norms. And that actually there are non-fixed assets that women would prefer to inherit or to acquire. And I think one area of land policy that isn't really explored enough in this from a gender perspective is exactly that, is using rentals, so good quality, affordable rent, to empower women, because it gives women the opportunity to be in the proximity of employment opportunities, of education opportunities. And if it's available, then women can, for instance, move to cities. And that's kind of what we see in the Gulf region, where rates of ownership are extremely low. And although it's very early days and a lot of the rental arrangements in the Gulf region are simply not adequate, and there's actually a lot of insecurity within men and women who reside in them, but it's something that we need to explore a bit further and actually ask men and women, what do they prefer? Do they prefer to inherit this piece of land and property, or would they prefer to move somewhere else and maybe inherit non-fixed assets? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. And this will bring us to the third part of this webinar to discuss more concretely about how access to information, data, technologies will be instrumental to support and empower women, their capacity to access land. I would like to bring in someone from the audience, Winnie Kamau. Winnie, I would like to ask you, I would like to ask you, from your perspective as a journalist, how are women using technology and data or the media to elevate their voices in Kenya, where you work, and advocate for their land rights and housing? Can you bring in your experience?
Hi, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to be able to share some of my experiences and some of the things that we have seen. I hope you can hear me. There's some construction being done in the office, so I'm trying to buffer out all the noise. So in Kenya, I'm from Nairobi, Kenya, and we have a law that was passed in the 80s, and then it's a succession law. And then in the 90s, it was amended to include both men and women, that the sons and daughters would inherit land, and despite their gender and whether they're married or not. But this has not been adhered to. So over time, the cultural practices is that the people do not get, in many cultures, because we are many communities in Kenya, in many cultures, women do not inherit. They are seen as, they are seen as passerbys in the family, in that they will come in the family as girls, they will grow up as big daughters, and once they grow up, they are eligible for marriage, and once they are married, they are now given off to their suitors and to their husbands. So women culturally, in many cultures in Kenya, are seen as passerbys. So they are not entitled to inherit any piece of land. So that poses a danger, even though in law it has been accepted and the government has already issued the directive and they've already gazetted everything, the women should inherit land. Culturally, this is just seen like it's an abomination for a woman to be able to inherit a piece of land. So that's where the clash is. But over time, we're looking at some of the tools that have empowered women and enabled women to be able to acquire land. And we're looking at the social media channels that have really helped women. Looking at Facebook, looking at WhatsApp. So what women have done, they've come together in small groups, and they know they do not stand a chance of owning land, because land in Kenya is very expensive. Owning land is very expensive, and if you can't get land, you can't inherit land from your parents or from your husband, then you come together as a group, young women, old women, they come together. There's this thing, we call it chama. So you create a community, a small community, and you are able to bring in, you give in your money, you appoint a treasurer, you appoint like how would I say it? It looks like what we call table banking. You come together as friends, you appoint a treasurer who is in charge of the money and who collects the money from you every month, and with the mission of owning a piece of land. At the end of maybe 1 year or 2 years, you'll have collected enough. Every month you've come together and you meet, people meet. And with the COVID pandemic, people are meeting virtually. So you meet up on Zoom or Google Meet or WhatsApp, and you chat and you talk about, you identify a piece of land you'd like to buy. And then from there on, you go in, and you can even involve, there are groups which have involved banks who give them collateral, who give them money, loans, and they're able to buy pieces of land. And from there, they are able to empower themselves, because once you have a title deed, then you're an empowered woman, because then you can always use it as a collateral for the next loan and to be able to empower yourself and grow yourself. we're looking at channels like Facebook. So like Facebook, we found that there are groups that have been created by young men and women. And here they're able to display, like you can see their groups like for owning a piece of land, and people come together and they have the conversation. So how is it for you owning a piece of land? And there's also conversations that come up of how did you develop your land? You can develop your land for $10,000. You can develop your land for, you can buy land for $500. And from there on, as in from all these channels, people now are empowered. If you see a friend on Facebook owning a piece of land and showing off their house that they have been able to build, then you feel challenged as a human being. You're like, if so-and-so can own a piece of land, if so-and-so can be able to build on their piece of land, then I can also do it. So that's an empowering tool for us. And it is working, although the challenge of inheriting land from your parents and from your husband, it's still there, but people are finding ways to circumvent the challenge that is there. Yeah.
Thank you, Winnie. Thank you. This is a great example of how access to information, even using social media, really empowers.
Oh, sorry, Laura, I also forgot to say that currently the government is digitizing land data. So very soon, maybe they will be able to share with us the data, and hopefully it will have captured the gender disaggregated data. Yeah.
And hopefully it will be easier to, they need to digitize data, yes, but they also need to make it open, right?
Yes, yes.
Mind the great work that
Sorry.
from Groot, Kenya is doing in your country in empowering women to have access to disaggregated data and use the data actually to advocate for better laws and policies and women rights, as well as our colleagues in Brazil, in Pernambuco, doing a great job in empowering women by organizing groups of women to assess and analyze gender data. Let me go now to Foteine, back to another question. Of course, the technology can be used as a tool to raise voices, but one of the main discussions during the Arab Line conference was also data for transparency. It can also increase transparency and accountability. So what do you think the implications are for women in this region? Foteine.
Yeah, well, data transparency has first of all to do, in my opinion, with trust and how women could get access to all these digital technologies. So it has to do with information, it has to do with knowing their rights, it has to do also evaluating what are the current policies and legislation around their land rights, for example. And all this could be done with capacity building, raising awareness. It's exactly what Winnie mentioned earlier. It can be done through consultations and knowing their rights. And of course, governments should also have a role in this with the relevant data infrastructure, with the digital platforms, with the relevant policies. Everything should be into consideration to enhance data transparency. So another issue I would say is for women to know the benefits of when they're sharing their data, because in many cases they don't receive and they don't get back the value from the sharing their data, the services and the products. That's an issue that needs to be addressed in overall, not only about their land rights, but in general their data rights. What is important, I would say again, is to work more about the legislation, the current legislation. What Obreta mentioned, I think it's a very, very good example how things could move more, forward in the MENA region. Yeah, I think it's an excellent initiative. I think it's an excellent progress, but it needs to raise awareness and empowerment of women to know their rights and really protect their rights in general. This is what I would say.
Thank you, Foteini. Let's hear from Miriam's again now on how technology helps women to access their land rights in Jordan.
Yes, I would like to show you, or I don't know if we have time, but if you go to the website of the Jordan Land Department, you can see that you have access, you can zoom in to each plot number. You could also do a request, not online, but asking about the property owned by your father, your grandfather. I mentioned since 10 years, you are obliged by law to know precisely. Okay, but what is not mentioned is that the price of land, women are kept ignorant of the real value of the land they are renouncing to. And most of the time they are given a symbolic compensation, but not equivalent to the money we are talking, amount of money. I want to give you an example. This is linked to the lack of taxation of vacant urban land within the cities in the Arab world. We have taxation now since 2015 in Saudi Arabia. Okay, we don't have that in the other cities. So what is the impact? When Winnie spoke about accessing land for $500, you cannot access anything in Jordan with $500 because I want to tell you, a plot of land, 1,000 square meters within Amman is $1 million. Okay, $1 million, the plot of land, 1,000 square meters. If you go, of course, in the countryside, it will be $10,000 to $50,000, but you need to gather that amount of money when your salary as a teacher will be $300 or $400, or maybe let's say as an engineer you will reach $1,000. You know, so we are talking about big money and big business, and this is a men's world. You know, they are not. Most of the discussion, they are not informed about that, and even there is underestimation of the value of land. You know, so when we talk about the fact that it's a glass ceiling, it's a real economic glass ceiling to women, because if you do not inherit or if you don't have a rich husband, you know, you will not get large property. You cannot get them, you know, except for inheritance, of course, and it's really interesting because Joseph mentioned that and also I think Foteini. You must distinguish between inheritance of money and inheritance of land. We're talking about land, but money, you could renounce to your money also, but it's it's more difficult because you receive a check in your own name. You could not sign a power of attorney. You cannot renounce. Even if you're sick, you will be carried, you know, but you must go to the Sharia court of your locality to receive your check. Okay, so this is also important. You know, you cannot deprive economically. You know, maybe I'll go into details. And another point I would like to say, and we didn't mention that. Of course, you have hope. Okay, but you could take the example of Turkey, and it doesn't give a lot of hope. Since 1926. You have the Swiss civil code that is applied and equality in inheritance between men and women. So you have 1 century, you know, to look at what happened and what happened. You have, it's okay, property, female property in the cities, in the large cities. But in the Anatolian region, in the southeastern region, women still are under pressure, you know, to renounce their rights. So let's go back to, of course, as Winnie mentioned, you have information, okay, social media, you can discuss about the transactions, the prices, what you are renouncing to. Also, you could, so I mentioned inheritance of money. You could also mention the fact that women own 22% of shares of companies. And for me, this is fascinating, 22% of shares, you know, in Jordan are owned by women. So, okay, in detail, sometimes they have to sign another contracts, you know, telling that they will not decide by themselves about the selling of this action and shares. These are ways for the husband and father to hide or to protect some of the assets, you know, in case of default of payment, in case of bankruptcy or something like that. So in fact, I hope that what's happening since 10 years, digitization, social media, forums, and also female women, businesswomen, you know, you have, of course, you have an elite, you have a bourgeoisie, you have a high bourgeoisie. And in the light bourgeoisie, when you marry, it's elegant to receive an apartment in your own name, you know, it's not even be co-owner. I mean, you're from the elite, of course, you will marry this fancy man and have this fancy apartment because you know that in case of divorce, you enter poverty. Poverty. Compare the status of poverty of divorced men to divorced women in the MENA region. This is strange because your brother is supposed to support you. You know, you have the mukawama, they are supposed to support you. So I don't want to be more rigid, but let's say only 16% of women are working with a salary. Where are our Marie Curie? Where are our genius? Where are all the women who could have deposed some, you know, comment dit-on, des patent, you know, how is it? Patent, you know? Who are the women with patent? Who are the Arab, you know, why? Where are they? They are secondary school teachers, university at best, you know? This is the only hope we have, you know, to reach excellencies in academia and sometimes enter the World Bank or UN, you know? This is terrible. I think this is terrible. So anyway, thank you.
Institution of powers, no?
Yes.
Power relations between men and women in society, of course. You touch a very interesting point about absence of land value transparency. No, we access information, yes, but what information? There's someone from the audience that would like to say something about it. Let me give the floor to Rafik Chouri to talk about a couple of minutes to say to share his perspective. Rafik, over to you. Take the floor, please. Just unmute yourself.
Yes. Do you hear me now, Laura?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, good afternoon to everybody. Good morning to our colleagues from the United States and Americas. I wanted to congratulate everybody for the very interesting presentations that we have heard. I would like to say one or two things. First of all, transparency, land value transparency is a major issue in the Arab world. And in particular when it comes, of course, to land. We have in Europe the reports, public reports, for instance, about land transactions, and the value of the square meter for an apartment, for instance, is well known, and the value of agricultural land also is very well known, and it is monitored and it is published. So I mean, these issues we are still to be valid and available in the Arab world. This is fundamental. I wanted also to say one thing about women, and it is clear now. We have there are several reports saying that women students in the Arab world are much more interested now than their male fellow colleagues in scientific, technical, engineering, and mathematical studies. So I think that we should develop training in terms of geographic information for all these women who are working in such fields, so that the use of the production of data and the use of at least open softwares can be, I mean, a tool to empower them, at least from the scientific point of view, and encourage them to be more productive in this particular regard. And this could also help them to empower their rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Chori. Interesting perspective. Remaining on land values and taxes, there is a question from the audience I would like to address to Wael, if you wish to respond. The question is, I would like to know if land is sold or exchanged in Arab countries, and if so, are women allowed to buy land?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The Arab countries is a free market, I would say, with regard to land. There is no restriction in any of the Arab countries to buy, and sell property. Very vibrant, land market in most all of them. And absolutely, women have the full right, by law, to buy property, to own property, to own it jointly with the husband. As well as we discussed, to inherit it according to, to the existing laws. Most of them are Sharia, laws. So there really no restrictions with regard to the buying land. On the valuation and the inheritance, let me just say one thing. When we say the inheritance land, women, we call for, women to get their rightful inheritance to land. That does not mean that they will get a small piece of land, and every time there is some kind of an inheritance, especially in areas where the land holding is very small. And if you're going to divide the land to give to the rightful heir, the deceased person, you will end up with a very, very small parcels of land, and economically speaking, that probably is not the best way to do. And therefore, what we call for, is women get their rightful inheritance. Now, in some cases where the land cannot be divided because it's too small, the value of the land need to be, determined. And this is where I think the valuation of the land becomes, very important, so that women can get, their fair share, in monetary, terms with regard to their share of the inheritance, of the land. So it's not necessarily in every time, the women will get a small piece of land or part of the building or the apartment, but the system should allow the fair valuation according to the market value, and getting the market value is not, it can be done easily, in my view, in certain cases, even if the government does not have the mass appraisal techniques to determine market value, but they can, hire valuers in order to determine the fair market value, of the property.
Yes, thank you, Wael. And fragmentation of inherited land is also a problem for having plots that are not big enough to manage to be profitable, says Rima Bagdaki from the audience. And let's now ask another question. When you look to the data on agriculture holding, women's in Arab countries are holding less than 10%. What are the main causes? Can't we think of the polygamy as kind of a cause, because this make husband having to kind of distribute their land to many wives? Who wants to respond to this question, address this issue from our panelists? We're talking about social norms here.
I just want to say, I don't know, I guess Joseph studied that, but no, there's no impact. And polygamy, most really, it's really a little phenomenon. It's less than 9% of wedding in Jordan, and even sometimes it's, really, it's not well spread, and I don't think, but
it's not impacting as much.
No, but.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. So we are, I think, at the end. I wanted to thank all the panelists and your great contribution to the discussion. I think you have been, your contribution have been invaluable and so diverse and bringing different perspectives. Thank you so much. I hope the webinar was interesting. You will find the recording on the Line portal if you want to distribute to your colleagues or in our YouTube channel. Thank you for attending. And we have another webinar scheduled on the 22nd of April on indigenous and how they contribute to reduce carbon emissions and mitigate climate change. Please keep following us. Thank you again and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.